The primary seal of the apex spire's grand airlock screamed as the harmonic resonance of the Astrum conclave failed. It was a sound like shattering glass, amplified by the vacuum of space. Inside the chamber, Kalen Thorne stood at the center of a circle of panicked crystalline nobles, his dark navy jacket perfectly pressed, his hand steady as he opened a dull gray diplomatic case. The violet dust of the exterior nebula was already frosting the reinforced glass, a death sentence in a pretty shade of purple. He didn't look at the looming Archon Malachur. He looked at the biometric lock on his case. How much is a life worth when the air starts to taste like ozone and old mistakes? If you are ready to see what happens when the galaxy's smallest player holds the only key to the door, subscribe and stay tuned. Now, let's go back to when the tea was still warm. 2 days earlier, the atmospheric light in the high-tier observation wing had been a soft, artificial amber. I remember the weight of the silence, most of all. It was the kind of heavy, institutional quiet that only exists in places where history is written by the winners. I was sitting across from Kalen, watching him adjust a small silver pin on his lapel. On the table between us sat a cold, half-finished cup of synthetic standard brew tea. The liquid had filmed over, abandoned on its pressurized heating plate as we reviewed the initial filings for the Ascendance trials. Kalen hadn't touched it in an hour. The registry officials are calling it a circus act. Kalen, I said, my vocal membranes vibrating with a dry, rhythmic click. They expect you to fail the trial of lineage before the first sun sets. Kalen didn't blink. He just stared at the tea, which meant the registration was intentional. Let them watch the circus, he replied, his voice a flat, Welsh-tinged baritone that felt unnervingly grounded in a room designed to make beings feel small. People usually miss the structural supports when they're looking at the acrobats. The Astrum conclave had ruled this sector for 8 centuries. Their bodies were living stone, their legacies etched into the very hull of the spire. To them, the Sol Alliance was a footnote, a rounding error in a galaxy of empires. They saw a human diplomat in a pressed jacket and saw a curiosity, a temporary amusement for the third daughter of their great house, Lumina. But I was the senior registry liaison. My job was to notice the things the Archons ignored. And what I noticed were the crates. 2 sealed diplomatic cases, heavy and nondescript, sitting near the door of Kalen's transitional quarters. They were out of place next to the rhythmic, slightly annoying hum of a decades-old maintenance drone parked in the corridor outside. The drone had been there since the last expansion era, a piece of forgotten infrastructure that everyone walked past. The first trial, the trial of lineage, began in the Hall of Records. It was a cathedral of ego. The walls were miles of inscribed crystal, detailing conquests that spanned millennia. Kalen stood at the base of the podium, looking like a speck of dust against the backdrop of Astrum history. Archon Malachur presided, his voice a deep, resonant boom that shook the floor. Present the lineage of the Sol Alliance, Malachur commanded, his crystalline skin catching the rotating light of the overhead arrays. Kalen stood. He didn't speak of kings or crusades. Instead, he spoke of the highlands of Ethel and the cold, hard dirt of a world that had tried to freeze his ancestors out a dozen times. He spoke of the Great Plagues. He described the treaties made in the ashes of nuclear fire, agreements that held because the alternative was extinction. He talked for 22 minutes. The hall remained silent. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of a judge who had already reached a verdict. Malachur made a note on his pad, a single flick of a stylus that categorized the entire human history as claims under review. I watched Kalen sit down. He looked at his hands, then at the empty space where his tea should have been. The trial of wealth was an exercise in institutional arrogance. In the financial registry, the Astrum controllers sat behind desks carved from single blocks of obsidian, their eyes tracking the shimmering exchange rates of the Covenant's 17 primary currencies. Kalen handed them a data pad that felt light, almost insubstantial, in the face of such opulence. The numbers didn't make sense to them. The first controller ran the audit twice, then 3 times, his crystalline fingers clicking against the interface with increasing agitation. The Sol Alliance's economic output, when converted from their independent credits, was an impossible figure. It was a massive, sprawling, and deeply integrated network of trade that existed entirely outside the Conclave's oversight, a shadow empire built on the back of medical stations and hypergate maintenance that the galaxy had simply forgotten to count. But they weren't looking at the door. By the fifth day, the spire was buzzing. A wager was running among the Dorvathy merchants on whether Kalen would survive the trial of endurance, which required 6 hours in a gravity-enhanced chamber. Kalen went in, settled into the seat, and fell into a deep, rhythmic sleep. He woke up 5 hours later with a crease on his cheek and asked where he could find a decent breakfast. The examiner, a man who had seen kings weep in that room, logged the result as inconclusive because the manual had no category for a human who was simply too tired to care about physics. The night before the wedding, I found him on the outer observation deck. He was staring at the stars, his silhouette framed by the massive, rotating rings of the spire. Lumina stood beside him. She wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at Kalen with the expression of a scientist who had finally found the missing variable in a century-long equation. Then the airlock failed, and now, in the screaming chaos of the decompression chamber, Archon Malachur was realizing his mistake. The secondary seals had been bypassed by the surge, leaving the spire's most elite residents trapped in a pocket of failing atmosphere. Kalen Thorne didn't panic. He reached into his gray case and pulled out a physical document, a service agreement signed 15 years ago that gave the Sol Alliance exclusive maintenance access to the emergency grid. The codes, Kalen said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind, are changed every 3 years. And since your people found the maintenance work too unglamorous to oversee, I suggest you step back while I reconnect the primary life support manually. He slammed a heavy override key into the console. The screaming stopped. The violet dust was cut off by a shimmering blue field of soul-designed energy. Silence. The wedding proceeded 3 hours later. It was no longer a circus. The registry officials moved with a frantic, redirected energy, their styluses flying as they realized the human they had mocked held the keys to their entire communications network. Lumina didn't smile as we stood at the altar, but she held Kalen's hand with a grip that suggested she knew exactly what kind of power she had just married into. Kalen's quarters were empty the next morning. The small, printed photograph of the Highlands of Ethel was gone from the nightstand. Only the decades-old maintenance drone remained in the hallway, its rhythmic, slightly annoying hum finally falling silent as its power cell reached the end of a 30-year cycle.